Thanks very much, News Laundry, Abhinandan, for dragging me into this. If my voice sounds a little croaky, it's because I've been speaking so much truth to power that it's knocked it out of business. No, I've actually just had a slightly running kind of cough flu thing, so apologies for that. So essentially, the way we were discussing with how we'll format the panel, let me just actually first quickly properly introduce the panel, because they've all done some fantastic work. So Suki Kim is the only writer to ever go undercover in North Korea. She's an award-winning novelist, and she visited the country 5 times over a decade, witnessing both Kim Jong-il's 60th birthday celebrations and his death in 2011. Her 6 months in Pyongyang, living and working as a teacher to the sons of North Korea's elite, gave her unprecedented insights into the country's current state. Sarah Shourd, I hope I've got that correct, is a journalist, author, and educator based in Oakland, California. For the last 5 years, her work was focused on exposing the cruelty and overuse of solitary confinement in US prisons. Sarah was awarded the 2016 Community Hero Award by San Francisco's Glide Memorial Church. She, along with 2 other Americans, was taken into custody by Iranian border guards for crossing into Iran while hiking near the Iranian border in Iraqi Kurdistan, and she was released 14 months later on humanitarian grounds. She was also telling us that she does her storytelling and her journalism through unconventional ways as well, through through theater and so on and so forth. Hartosh Singh Bal, of course, of Caravan, perhaps needs less introduction than some of the other panelists. He's been doing terrific journalism over the years, and continues to be a fierce and outspoken voice, especially in this current environment. So I thought the way that we would structure this is that we would broadly get everyone to talk a little bit about their own specific instances of speaking truth to power, as it were, and then we would broaden it into a wider discussion on what is happening with the media, both here and around the world, particularly America. And then we'll take some questions and answers at the end. So let me just quickly set the frame of that a little bit before I jump in. And essentially, the way that I see it is that in terms of what is happening here and in the US and indeed in other parts of the world with the media, and this whole business of speaking truth to power, or rather the failure to do that, seems to stem quite specifically in the recent context as the revenge of the right. And what I mean by that is that, of course, the conventional or the familiar grievance of the right, that they've been excluded from the liberal mainstream media and have therefore sought to capture the agenda, the media agenda, by the alternative media, which is whether it's social media, whether it's WhatsApp. In America, you have radio, you have YouTube, and you have blogs and so on. And use that, as it were, to set the agenda. And to some extent, they've been very successful in doing that. They've been very successful in discrediting the mainstream media. They've been very successful in demonizing the terms like liberal, in India terms like secular, and so on. Now, the difference between what has happened here and to some extent in America is that that entire project in America has still largely been confined, even though that was a key factor in propelling the victory of someone like Trump. That has largely been confined even now to the so-called alternative media. You'll still find that it's mostly websites like Breitbart and YouTube channels like InfoWars, where you'll still get that kind of alt-right conspiracy theorizing, hate-mongering, fake news spreading narrative. The mainstream media there has largely held their ground and is doing a fairly good job of speaking truth to power. It's almost as if adversity has raised the game of journalism there, except for Fox News, which continues to remain a kind of partly embedded propagandist for the Trump administration. While in India, as we know, it's been somewhat the reverse. In India, to a large extent, the mainstream media, at least I would say 90% of TV news and a good section of print news, have become propagandists for the government. So instead of speaking truth to power, they're speaking power's version of the truth. And this is something which, we've seen this develop over a period of time, where essentially what we have here are news networks and indeed to some extent newspapers who attack the government's critics, who defend its failings, who deflect attention from its mediocrity. And in fact, someone actually compared them to North Korean channels. So that's the kind of media distinction between what has happened in the West and where we are today. So what does that mean for democracy when that happens? How do we get out of there? And where do we go from here? These are some of the rhetorical questions that we'll try and answer over the course of the discussion. So let me just jump in with you, Suki, because you've had the North Korean experience. Firstly, I've never actually watched a North Korean TV channel. What is it like exactly?
Well, North Korea is a land of nothing else but the great leader. It's one of, if not the most brutal regime in the world. There is no freedom of anything. Media, obviously, is only about the great leader. There's only one newspaper, which is 6 pages long. Every article is about the great leader. So you just don't get television with one channel, every single program from 5:30 until about 11:30. Every single program is about the great leader. So that's the condition in that country, which has now lasted for over 70 years and is considered the most brutal nation. The problem with North Korea really is not so much, of course it is, within the country. That's about changing that nation. But reporting on North Korea has been one of the most problematic aspects. You have the biggest gulag in the world, which no journalist can really get into. And basically what you hear about North Korea is often complete untruth. Or the state-sponsored visit. You will see, there will be like BBC going in there for a couple of days or CNN going in there for a couple of days. That's a sponsored visit, meaning North Korean government sanctioned that visit. And when the anchor arrives, you are given a set of people to interview, and the questions you can ask are all prescripted. So once you do a reporting like that, which is traditional reporting on North Korea, then what is that? Is that journalism, or is that actually a publicity machine for the world's biggest, worst regime? So there's a really, it's an interesting dilemma with North Korea when you actually watch. I actually think it's one country where foreign policy has utterly failed, but so has journalism, has absolutely failed when it comes to North Korea.
So why would you say that? Are you saying that, if you take your own example, you said that you were only able to report it in a much more honest way because you literally had to go undercover to bring out what was actually going on.
Because if I am writing down what because no one can get in there unless you get the government's permission.
Right.
So you are chosen by that government to go in with a government minder and interview the people government has now decided for you to interview. Then I just do not see where journalism fits into that scenario. That's a publicity material, right? So then what other way is there to write about this country when you actually cannot go in? You have to find a way of going in that might not be the traditional way, and you have to embed yourself in the system, because interviewing somebody does not work. In our equation in journalism, you interview someone, you get an answer. North Korea, it's like going into a Disney World and you're interviewing Cinderella.
Last question to you before I move on. When you actually came out and you were able to report on a lot of what you did you face any threats? Was there any pressure from the North Korean government? How did that play out?
Well, when I was in there, I had to, everything I wrote, I put them on USB sticks and erased everything from the laptop every single time I signed off. I created a document within a document so that it looked actually like a classroom material, because my cover was actually as a teacher, evangelical teacher. So I could keep like a classroom material on my computer, but actual notes for the book began like page 100. So it was document buried in a document. So this thing that I kept it on USB stick, obviously being there, if that was found out with a minder living in the same building directly below me 24/7, that risk was far greater. Afterward, of course, I was threatened constantly to first send them the document. Once they found out that there was a book coming out, and the whole thing was actually about the book, it took me about a decade. And then also threats came that, but by then, it's such a scary topic. The threat after I came out my final time, it's scary, but I was dealing with it for years.
Right. You were sort of hardcore by then. Sarah, I want to ask you, I know that your work, when you talk about writing about what's happening within the prison system, may be slightly different from what we're debating, the wider subject of speaking truth to power. But in a sense, it's also important that those kinds of stories get told as well, isn't it? Because what you're doing, in a way, is challenging a lot of the conventional assumptions that Americans would have about the prison system. And that leads then for governments' power, quote unquote power, to react.
No, exactly. I mean, I think a lot of it sounds familiar to me in reporting on prisons in the US, because prisons are the sort of totalitarian state within a state with absolutely no transparency. As a journalist, you can't go into US prisons unless there's a guard there, and also they select which prisoner you're going to interview, and so the whole thing is just set up as a propaganda tool. So a lot of the research, I did 2 years of research in the US into solitary confinement. There are over 100 people held in extreme isolation in US prisons, many of them for over a decade, with no human contact, no rehabilitation, nothing at all. And many times these are not even violent criminals, they're often the political prisoners, the people whose voices they want to silence. They just try to disappear them into what we call the hole. So yes, I had to use unconventional means in the sense that I wrote letters, but of course those letters are censored. I visited 13 prisons around the country and got to know prisoners very intimately. But I wove all these stories into a play, a sort of investigative, theatrical piece of journalism, and I used my imagination to get around the sort of obstacles presented by the system.
Hartosh, now, I think in a sense what tends to happen is that we tend to take our media freedoms for granted in India, but with what has been happening recently, when you hear descriptions of how Suki describes the North Korean media, I know we're still a long way away from that, and it makes for a funny one-liner or a tweet when you say that we have channels or we have media outlets that function like that. But what do you think is responsible for that? Why have we ended up at a point where till fairly recently, it seemed that there was an enormous public interest in seeing power held accountable, in talking about the government's failings, and that would get a lot of traction. But today what worries me is the fact that it appears to be the reverse, that people seem to have almost suspended their sense of critical thinking, and they actually want to consume large amounts of what appears to be propaganda, or are happy to see the opposition being attacked and the government being defended. So how is that conventional inversion, or the inversion of that assumption we all make as journalists, why do you think that's taken place?
Two things. First of all, our problem really starts from the point where a story is to be told. In India, good stories which question authority or power are pretty easy to come by. Problem is finding outlets where you can tell those stories, because there is almost, let's say, an ownership-driven censorship that exists across the media. Institutionally, the media has never been strong, and the previous governments have been responsible for undermining that freedom. And this was true during the Congress period. I mean, when we at Open published the Radia tapes, it was not as if it was a great scoop. It was a story that was available to everybody. What we did was that we provided the space for telling a story that nobody else was willing to tell. Right. And for example, I lost my job during the Congress regime. That was also problematic. Nobody wanted to hear that at that point of time. What has happened subsequently, I think, is this phenomenon has been tied to the larger change in politics. And that politics is that the cult of Modi is also a cult of an upper caste Hindu elite, most of the people that we are addressing through the English media have bought into that cult. Today, to question that cult is hugely problematic, and institutions have already been weakened. Modi didn't weaken those institutions, they were already weak. So these things put together are leading to the current situation where, one, you have this tremendous blowback. I mean, if I say something critical of the Modi regime, what I'm told is, you are a Radia journalist. What does that mean? That I'm probably one of those people who were on the tapes exchanging information with the Congress government. It's a different matter that we were responsible for publishing that story, but that's not common memory. The second thing, I faced a lot of criticism during the Congress regime, but that criticism was on facts. The blowback that today I will get is that I'm a Khalistani. Now, that has nothing to do with my personal views. It is because I come from a certain religion, a certain minority, that the best way to demolish me is to buy into the narrative that somebody is anti-national, is not patriotic enough, so what he has to write or say is not to be believed. And that is really what has happened in this country.
Let me just try to expand this into what's happening in America, and Sarah and Suki, please feel free to come in. That, to the extent that what Hartosh is saying, that there is this definitely a climate where it is harder to be critical of the government. At the same time, you have a lot of pushback. You have, at least in America, you have the New York Times, the Washington Post, even CNN, becoming much more incisive in their critique of what's going on. You have a large number of websites that are constantly doing fact-checking and exposing fake news, exposing manufactured facts. But at the same time, what happens when you have a reading or a viewing public who are not interested in the facts, where an entire polity has become so polarized that each person just wants to absorb their version of the truth? How does journalism confront that?
I think on one hand, the trend in the United States in the media, there's some positive developments. I mean, the New York Times coming out and just calling Trump a liar. In the past, that would have been seen as, too much opinion, or sort of not having journalistic integrity. But it's just the blatant truth. We're as journalists, we need to report the truth, and when our president is a liar, we have to call him a liar. So I think that journalists have to, not taking a stand is seen as taking a stand. Journalists have to show that they are living, breathing, feeling human beings that have opinions in the world. And that doesn't take away from their impartiality. It's actually a sort of form of self-transparency. But on the other hand, the division is just getting deeper and deeper and more intractable. So I'm working on a podcast right now to try to address this. It's called Of Two Minds, where I try to get people that are deeply divided, for example, a prison warden and a formerly incarcerated person, to have a conversation. Not to try to get them to agree, because they're probably not ever going to agree, but to explore the nature of their difference. Because both sides can get more intelligent and be more strategic if they actually understand the arguments of the other side, right? So really, it's in everyone's interest to bridge difference and to engage with it.
So I think in the case of America, with the whole polarized public, that's it's a serious problem. Literally, the one fan base of Trump they're not reading Washington Post or New York Times or the New Yorker. So if the information is not reaching that side at all, how is the bridge going to be formed? But then, you can only bring in the cases of other countries, where South Korea, for example, where we just had a president impeached and a new president came to power in last month, 2 months ago. It was really the public that led to that impeachment in South Korea. And that unbelievable historical moment, what they call 45-day revolution, was really brought about because of investigative journalism, where the repression of the media was so extreme because the former regime administration had really installed their own people. They just basically fired everybody, and the mainstream media became a propaganda tool for the government. And people, although it didn't seem like it, I think we're getting more and more and more tired of being fed this basically propaganda. However, the literacy level in South Korea is extremely high. So this is an educated public. So that finally, and that on top of people becoming sick of it, and also the fearless investigative journalists, serious work was being done by just a couple of individuals to constantly expose corruptions, just relentlessly. And I think it was a culmination of that work and people's frustration that really brought what seemed to be a miracle about. In 45 days, the whole presidency went down. And I think what was amazing watching that was that, I think that I was there actually. I wrote a whole piece for Guardian about it, the revolution, what was happening in South Korea in comparison to Trump rising in America, because protests were happening in both of my countries, in Korea and the US at the same time. And what I found amazing was how the mass people are very fickle. It seemed that people wouldn't be out there protesting against the last administration in South Korea. Millions came out. When the forces, I think, come out together, and I do think what really propels that is investigative journalism, because those are the people willing to tell the truth.
Let me put that to Hartosh as well in the Indian context. I mean, this whole question of the divide, as Sarah was saying, one way, of course, is to try and find different ways of telling the story or trying to bridge that divide. But for the most part, as journalists, our conventional work is to go out and try and bust the great myths of our time, to bust the official propaganda, to uncover whatever we discover under the surface. But if people are tuned off from that, if people still have more faith in WhatsApp forwards than they would with, let's say, a long, well-reported investigative piece, how do you get around that?
Look, it's almost impossible, and I'll give you a perfect example. We can all understand the divide that comes about because of opinion writing. You stand on one side or the other. But when the divide deepens and WhatsApp and social media are basically forums for countering any criticism of the government, narrative also suffers. I mean, one of the prime examples, and I'll just run through this, is what is happening with Swachh Bharat. I don't think anybody in this country is actually opposed to the idea that you have to build more toilets and ensure open defecation stops. I mean, one of the pieces of research that suggests something very startling is simply that if you plot just the density of open defecation in a country and look at child heights, India is exactly where you would expect given the amount of open defecation. It means that it's a huge public health problem. Child stunting of height stunting is directly related to this. Now, when you do a story on Swachh Bharat, making the point not that the scheme is a problem, but conceptually the way it has been examined overlooks essential issues of caste and how toilets are cleaned in this country. That you cannot just go build toilets and actually hope for social change on the ground. That story is then not part of public policy making. What happens is instead, there is an attempt to decry that story. This has been published by Caravan. It's a liberal magazine, don't pay attention to. These guys always go after Modi. These guys are always saying things about the government. As a result, there is almost no conversation possible on issues we are actually agreed on with the government. And that is actually the worst of it. Let's forget what is happening with other stories.
Okay, there's another aspect of this which I want to bring up, which is that speaking truth to power is an expensive business. That if you need that kind of public-spirited, investigative, long-form or in-depth journalism, it costs money. And newsrooms across the world are becoming increasingly strained and are not investing enough in that kind of journalism. Television is perhaps the most guilty, where I'm fortunate enough to do a weekly show where I go out to get to go out and investigate something and come out with it. But it's a weekly investigation is still kind of a shortcut. You get 3 or 4 days to get into something in depth. But for the most part, it's news of the instant. There does appear to be some change, at least in the West, when I look at the kind of work that, again, the mainstream media is doing there, the New York Times, Washington Post. They seem to be doubling down and doing, more long-form investigative work. So, I mean, that's a good thing. But to that extent, and let me begin with you, Sarah, do you find that even for the kind of work you do, that is it easy to actually get the resources and to get the funds, or is that a constant battle?
It's a constant battle. It's a very short answer. I think that a lot of times, I have 5 jobs. I'm very resourceful. You have to be very creative about how to a lot of the work that I've done, my bigger projects like the theater piece and now my podcast, it's been a year or more in development before I'm actually paid. The money comes, but you have to be, deeply committed to doing this deeper work. But the same is true for when I was doing more conventional journalism with the Daily Beast that was responding to daily events. That doesn't pay very well either. So this is a work of the heart.
Right. Suki, what about you? Do you agree that? Obviously, clearly there is a problem. There is always a financial crunch. But do you see a shift? Do you see once again that? When you have a situation, when you feel that free speech is under threat, when you feel that journalism is under threat, you could go the other way as well. You could begin to invest more in that. Do you at least see that happening to some extent in the American context? Just in terms of a greater investment in, more in-depth kind of journalism, of the kind of journalism you need that is able to speak truth to power, which is to expose, official malfeasance and so on.
I'm a book writer by nature. So, and anything I do basically are very long form pieces, very rarely, I would do small ones, but generally it's all long form. And those take really a long time to pull off, to research, and to do it properly. But, so I think there is a room for that, especially in this world where this fast kind of one-liners are coming out of woodwork, and they basically don't mean all that much, and things change all the time. So how are you going to make a difference, except it's not for in-depth, long-form journalism?
Right.
But that doesn't mean that, yes, dedication is there. I don't think they pay well at all. But why do we do it what we do? My book took a decade, most of which I funded through fellowships and different jobs constantly. And I don't think any of us who do this kind of work is in it for money. And I do think really a relief about this. For example, I had to cover the presidential campaign for the New Republic, where I had to do a portrait of one of the Republican candidates. I had to go out to Florida. I didn't have the budget, but I knew for this really long-form piece, I needed to really be out there in Florida for about a month, talk to every single person who knows him, and also travel to Iowa to go to caucuses. And a lot of that I somehow managed by staying with friends. And, so you do it with a dedication in order to really do great work, the best you can do. One really comforting thought about that, though, is that I feel personally the works that really make a difference, that really generate empathy in readership, are very few. It's not, I'm not putting down journalist work. I think a lot of them are very informative, but the ones that make a really great difference, it's just a handful. And those people probably do it with a dedication and just pull off some, it's not that every piece of journalism has to change the world. So I think that those who do, there are few examples I can cite who basically devote their lives and everything they've got to pursue the truth behind either this corruption or that corruption. Right. And you just have to do it because you are searching for truth. There's no other way.
Hartosh, tell us about the experience of Caravan. How do you sustain Caravan, firstly?
Look, the problem of funding in India is key, and it is very different from the West. We don't have fellowships, we don't have institutional support. The money has to come from whatever organization that is employing you. Look, the average Caravan story where a reporter spent 4 months on the story, traveling, and our reporters are using public buses to get to remote parts of the country. I myself, because I worked with the Express and now with Caravan, I still shy away, or I'm a little embarrassed spending more than 2,500 rupees on a hotel on a night anywhere in the country. I still worry about that. The total cost that the magazine will put out for a story like that will be about $1,000, $1,200 for 3 months of travel, work, etc. And that is the tops that anybody in India will ever fund on a story. It's almost impossible to work under those circumstances. So it's a miracle that stories actually come out at all. And there is no other sourcing of funds available anywhere else. Where do you go to? Where do you find out? Caravan itself, after spending that kind of money, is not getting it from the market. We are not a country where institutions or liberal values actually have a deep root in society. It's not as if after Modi was elected that there was a sudden influx of liberal funds, unlike in the US where there was suddenly you find that coffers were filled for many liberal institutions in terms of opposing. That's not happening here. And Caravan basically survived because it is subsidized by other magazines which are doing things which maybe Caravan itself may not feel very comfortable. There's a Greh Shobha, there is a Manohar Kahaniya, etc. That is what keeps Caravan going. That's the truth of journalism in this country.
I have a thought about that because, I was listening to different panels yesterday, and I was actually thinking it then too, because we talk a lot about at this conference about how to fund journalism, which I understand is very important, but I don't know from my experience if being paid a lot equates good journalism, to be honest. I just feel like I see a lot of CNN reports to me. I don't know, I don't watch those and think, wow, there's a great piece of journalism work there. So I feel like the really unbelievable, and you just said, you don't even know how these stories get written. I think the dedicated, serious journalists do them somehow. You find the resources just because you're so driven to tell the truth behind this. So this economic model of like you get paid more and you come out with a better work, I'm just not convinced by that at all.
Is that you still need a basic minimum to get a story done. Often finding that basic minimum in India is a problem. Basically.
Right. There's also the attendant problem of, the economic security or fragility of media institutions when it comes to speaking truth to power. Because let's face it, there are two essential risks that you face when you take on the establishment. You either will get, at least in the context of countries like India, you'll get the taxman raiding your office or raiding your proprietor's home, or you'll get a fat lawsuit from a corporation, right? Now, both of these are essentially symptoms in some ways of how strong media institutions are. Not just in terms of the kind of protections they have, like, for example, with the First Amendment in America, but also with their ability, just their financial ability to be able to withstand that kind of pressure, where your finances are so solid and so strong that even if somebody were to try and hurt you, you can withstand that. Or if you have the kind of institutions and legal and legislative protections that will shield you from that. And to that extent, Hartosh, I think that's again somewhere where we instantly almost become a banana republic, to the extent that no matter how much, let's say, a Donald Trump will rail against the American media, he'll call CNN fake news, he'll call New York Times a failing New York Times, he will publicly incite mobs of his supporters against the media. The chances of actually somebody raiding the offices, of trying to send US government agents to raid the offices of American, at least mainstream media institutions, is pretty far-fetched. That's not the case here.
Not just to do with media. It is structurally, we don't have institutions insulated from the government. Our economy does not function as a liberalized economy. To get ahead in business, you need to have contacts with the government to get permissions, etc. Much of big media is run by business owners who have interests either in media or outside, which require large fundings. And often that requires constant permission and interaction with the government. It gives the government direct leverage. Anybody in this country who is raising funds at a large enough extent would have violated the law at some point or the other. It's almost axiomatic in this country. Because of that, we remain vulnerable to government. Part of the point is most of those raids will often have rationales that will stand up in court. But the fact is that can be used over and over again, right, simply because we have not built the institutional framework where we have independence not just between media and the government, but business and the government. A top corporate, as in America, who can take on Trump, does not exist in India.
Right. Just from your own experience, because I'm not sure if you've had that experience, but when you report on, let's say, the prison system, because that's also heavily corporatized in America, is there ever any that kind of pressure or concern that you may, apart from the risks you face when actually doing the work, that there could be the threat of lawsuits, or there's some sort of pressure to actually prevent stories like that from coming out?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think it's kind of a catch-22, right? This sort of speaks to what Suki was saying, that even if your organization has financial stability, sort of the more that you have, the more you have to lose, right? So the bigger the organization, like CNN, the more they tend to play it safe because they don't want to get sued. I work as an independent journalist. I don't have to worry about that as much, knock on wood. But something this also brings to mind is, of course, there's a financial risk, and we also have to keep in mind of our subjects. I mean, the people that I write about in solitary confinement, these are people that have everything to lose. They're telling their stories, they're speaking their truth, and facing retaliation from guards, beatings. Anything could happen. They could get killed by another inmate for saying something. So if you're talking about the risks that we're taking as journalists, we constantly have to keep in mind the risk that our subjects are taking.
Right. Okay, I'm told we don't have much time before we go to questions, so let's just move away a little bit from all the kind of negative hand-wringing and the breastbeating that we tend to do at these panels, while in fact we actually have 3 terrific journalists who do fantastic work, and whether at all that work leads to any change. It's not just about, the appalling state of journalism. So let me just ask each of you this question, starting with you, Suki. I mean, when your book came out, when all of those facts came out, what sort of response did you get? Firstly, were people within North Korea at all able to, read any of what you'd written? Or even if they didn't, outside of that, did that change the narrative in any way?
No, people in North Korea would not have heard anything about the book at all because they don't get any freedom at all. They're just forever watching programs about the great leader.
There's no sort of backdoor way of accessing what's happening in the rest of the world, VPN servers, whatnot?
In the border area, North Korea bordering China, so in that area, the border is very, you do see information might seep through, but it wouldn't be stuff about my book. It would be things like some soap opera that they'll get, So the book, but I never wrote the book thinking this is going to change the North Korean public. It was more the English speakers out in the world who are so either uninformed or misinformed about North Korea. So it was really about that. I mean, I think I actually faced a lot of backlash after the book came out because this wasn't undercover work. There's really no other way of covering North Korea. So the fact that it was undercover work, also being a woman, I think probably there's a lot of female journalists out there. Being a woman, they called it a memoir instead of investigative journalism and packaged it as sort of this a girl's journey to go find herself in Pyongyang, North Korea. Sort of this eat, pray, love North Korean way was how the American public wanted to believe it. And then, of course, the critics came out, who are these North Korean experts. Most of them have, never been to North Korea or speak a word of Korean, have now come out and called me a liar. But when you think about it, undercover is lying. I mean, how else are you going to go into North Korea? So, this backlash was just actually endless, and it was a second chapter of fighting the injustice. Power, that speaking truth to the power, actually had another angle where I then ended up fighting sexism and racism in publishing, which was all ruled by white men in America. So that was the population then I was now fighting through each step of the way.
Oh dear, okay.
One thing, so that they even got, my book was originally like this, where they called it a memoir, My Time with the Sons. There's something a little dodgy about a woman's time with her sons. And I fought and fought and fought, and they wouldn't let me do it any other way. After I wrote this essay, which went viral, which ran in the New Republic in 2016 last year, the publisher finally came to me and said, we will get rid of that word memoir and change My Time to Undercover Among the Sons. So this was Speaking Truth to Power, part 2.
Okay, Hartosh, one story that you'd say, just didn't sort of die a natural death, but where you actually found that there was some kind of shift, I don't know, narrative, policy, whatever.
Look, in India, policy shifts don't happen. I mean, that's the unfortunate truth. And I'll tell you, and I think we have to be realistic about journalism. It's the difference I often cite that as long as we are reporting starvation, you expect the government to react. And I've seen it myself in Madhya Pradesh. You go to the Sahara regions, people are dying. You put out a story on the front pages, suddenly aid is rushed in. Maybe in that particular year, you end up saving a few lives, you make a difference to a few people at that point. But we are not very good at dealing with malnutrition, and you can report all you want on malnutrition. Right. On that, individually, you can't do anything, but put in with civil society institutions, work over years, accumulates. And various journalists, various civil society activists finally make differences in public policy in terms of where food is to be targeted in this country, etc. Those differences happen, but it won't happen due to individual stories. I mean, to me, the prime example is the Radia tapes was calling out for regulation of media itself. The relationship between media, politicians, and business. We don't have that today. I mean, that has bills on that have been submitted to Parliament, draft bills. A lot of discussion is, but you and I know that's never going to happen. And we live with that reality and we keep doing those stories again and again till somewhere something gives in the system. Lastly, it is just eventually you have to keep some truths alive. It doesn't matter how many times he's elected. Modi was complicit in mass murder. You have to keep reporting and saying that truth. That is part of our job. If people refuse to believe it, eventually maybe one day they will.
Sarah, what about you? I mean, with your own work and experience, do you find that, again, I'm not talking here about world-changing stuff, but do you find that there have been instances where it has sort of, you know, at least if not policy, at least influenced the narrative or the conversation around that subject?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, 7 years ago in the United States, people didn't know anything about solitary confinement. And if they did, they thought of them as the worst, most violent criminals beyond, you know, the hope of rehabilitation. And that story has really changed. And it started with articles, and policies have changed state by state where a lot of people have gotten out of solitary confinement. There have been many reforms. I think that part of the challenge was to humanize, and we talked about this over coffee, right? If you see someone that's suffering this kind of atrocity as inhuman, you know, as not someone that you could relate to or that as something that would ever happen to you or anyone that you love, there could be an article out or a report with facts, and those facts are not going to sway you. You're not going to read the article, right? And we talked about, you know, how do we bridge that wall of empathy so that people will read this incredible journalism that's out there. I know in India there's an incredible problem with, you know, forced bondage, right? That's sort of modern day slavery. And how do you get people to see that as someone, as a human being, deserving of the same respect as their own daughter or their own son? And I think you do this through storytelling, through narrative, through really wedding fact and narrative, so that storytelling affects our brains the same way as lived experience, which is why I used theater as an unconventional tool to sort of showcase my investigative work. Because when you go into a theater, you walk out a changed person physically. It affects your brain. And the way that your brain is affected affects the decisions that you make in the world. So people that came to my play told me afterwards that I couldn't sleep for days, which is not, you know, my goal to, you know, stop people from sleeping, but maybe it kind of is, because it shows that they were deeply, profoundly changed. Or they ran out of the theater, you know, sweating profusely. This is something that that is going to shift the story of an individual and shift the story of a whole culture.
Right. Okay, let's leave it at that, because I'm sure there'll be people who will have questions, and I'm not sure how much time we have. I think you mentioned 8 minutes. Okay.
My question is to Mr. Hartosh. Recently, Caravan came up with a story about judiciary and how CJI Kehar and the relationship between them is evolving. Now, you did stories about, say, Badals or Rajat Sharma, and the response that you may have got is predictable. The response from the authorities. How was the response formally and informally from the judiciary when you did that story?
Look, in India, doing a story on the judiciary is about the most difficult thing. And you can see from that story how carefully that story has been done. It will be very different from a story we do on the corporates or any other section. Because a single sentence is enough to literally close down the magazine if we get it wrong. And so you can only suggest many things, indicate many things. The law of contempt is one of the worst things that exist in this country. Even the truth is not defense against the judiciary thinking you are holding it in contempt. Because of that, you will see that the reporter has had to exercise the kind of caution that is almost impossible for anybody writing in the knowledge that there are certain things that are true, but you are unable to say it. And after that, no, you will not get a response because that judiciary is one institution that has not been subject to the scrutiny it deserves from the lower level up. Examining and questioning the judiciary is one of the most important things we have failed to do in this country.
Good morning, my name is Swati. My question is to Ms. Suki. Ma'am, you've been talking about the North Korean government. I would like to ask you what is about to be a civilian in North Korea, because in my knowledge there is a huge civilian crisis wherein people migrate and go to China where they've been harassed.
Mike, a little up.
They have been harassed and trafficked in China because people have been going as a refugee.
I think the question was about the civilian. Is that a question
Yeah,
about
I
the
wanted
civilian
you to-
crisis in North Korea?
Yeah, because
Leading to migration to China where there is
yeah, because in my knowledge, I feel that there is also a civilian crisis wherein they realize that they have been oppressed by the extremely oppressing regime. So there has been a civilian crisis. Is that a case?
Okay, I'm not very clear either. I think what she's trying to ask you is that what happens when ordinary citizens of North Korea realize that they're living under an oppressive regime?
That's a complicated question.
Because there have been a
right.
refugee.
So the civilians in North Korea, first of all, do not get any information. And everything is so controlled. Their movements are, they can't travel within the country or outside of the country. They don't get any information through the media or education. So all these people who also, it's like a religion. The great leader is not a president. It's more like a fundamental call to idolatry. So in a case like this, if one day they were to wake up and realize that everything they've been told are actually not true, the likelihood, and we've already seen through defectors, is that they become faith believers of another religion. So, that's why the missionary work in North Korea is really strong, although it's not even allowed. Defectors generally turn to fundamental Christianity. It's probably what will happen will be another, and I'm really sad to say it, but another dictatorship will fall there and settle very fast. The people are prime, ripe for another dictatorship.
Right. How familiar that sounds.
Last question.
My question is to Hartosh. Do you think there's a change in news consumption pattern in the way that now we take up to newspapers or TV channels which conform to our news? Like you just said, Caravan is a liberal magazine and it would print against certain authority. So now if I want to see something which would speak of this authority, and I would just put my consumption in that manner. Like prefer only those news channels which will offer me certain sort of things.
Well, I think that's an evident problem, isn't it? It's basically much of the recent generation, younger people are consuming media through social media. They've set their options such that they are living in an echo chamber where they'll look at their friends who think the same way, who will forward links which confirm their opinions, not challenge them. Well, that's the world we are living in. It is increasing divides. Again, I have no easy answer. That option lies with individuals to go outside the choices they make. But how do you enforce it? How does a single media organization get people to read? It's a difficult business. I have no easy answer to that one.
Also, I just want to quickly add to that I think this idea that there is something like the suggestion that there's something like the liberal media and therefore anything that the liberal media reports is biased or factually untrue is again, and I said this at the beginning, it's a clever way, it's a clever political strategy to discredit the idea that there is something like an absolute truth. It's not like everything is up in the air and there are facts and there are alternative facts. There is something like an absolute truth, which essentially the media's job is to establish and to report. And people need to understand that this is not something which is shrouded in ambiguity depending on which side of the fence you are. The facts are what they are, and I think the word it's not so much a battle between liberal versus illiberal or liberal versus conservative. It's between journalists and media organizations which are trying to report the facts and the truth, and others who are obfuscating it. I think that's the divide that we somehow have to bridge.
My name is Shujat Bukhari. I am a journalist based in Srinagar. Hartosh, you rightly said that the courts where you cannot tread, that's the area. But we have seen that the corporates are also using the courts, and we have the recent examples of Wire, and the immediate example is EP Tableau Editor. And also the government arm twisting as far as the advertisements are concerned, and especially in the smaller states like ours. So do you think that that's going to change, or it's going to continue? Is it because of the current regime, or it has been all along like this?
Well, I think the hold of corporates has increased post-liberalization. The larger the influence of advertising revenue on organizations, the more the problem with corporates. And yes, judiciary, the current government, and the third part is the failure to report on big corporates. We are facing a lawsuit from SR, a huge one. The EPW editor has just resigned, literally been forced to resign because of a lawsuit by Adani. Reliance is an unmentionable. I mean, you cannot do stories on Reliance. A car owned by the son late at night goes out, gets into an accident in Bombay. A story that should be front page news at 2 o'clock in the morning, what is that car doing? Gets buried. A building, and this is being reported today. Mukesh Ambani has built his house on Waqf property land meant for an orphanage, where land use has been changed after the land has been sold to the man. It is a scandal, but we will rarely get to hear these stories. It's because Reliance literally owns half the media in the country. Network 18, India TV, there is investment in NDTV, there is investment in 4 other channels, there's control from behind. How do you report on Reliance?
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you. You were great. Thank you, audience. Thank you.